Why does the world exist? I've been reading a book by Jim Holt with this title. And he points out at the very beginning of the book, he says, if you believe in God, you have an answer to this question. The world exists because God made it. But, he said, if you do not believe in God, the question, why is there something rather than nothing, might be very interesting. And so he goes and he interviews a fascinating piece of people, philosophers and theologians, cosmologists, particle physicists, astronomers. And the idea behind the book is that we can make rational arguments that will help us understand why the world is the way that it is. Now, I absolutely love books like this. I spend a huge amount of my time reading them. But I recognize there are two important problems that come up when you try to use just rational proofs to establish the existence or non-existence of God. The first has to do with language. From the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, I've learned that words really have a kind of agreed meaning, an implicit meaning when we use them in ordinary ways. But when we stretch them to include extremes, then they often lose their meaning. And oftentimes people who are trying to prove that God doesn't exist and people who are trying to prove that those people are wrong make that mistake. And a perfect example is the word nothing. Now, when I'm jogging downtown in San Francisco and someone on a street corner asks me if I have any money, I say, I have nothing. And that makes a lot of sense. But when you start to try to imagine what absolute nothing might be, absolute nothing doesn't make very much sense. As a matter of fact, the 16th century theologian or 17th century theologian Jonathan Edwards, he said absolute nothing is inconceivable. He even jokes, he said, maybe it's what sleeping rocks dream of. And that's the same problem that we have anytime you use absolute statements about God. When you say God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, it's stretching the meaning of those words to a context where they may not work any longer. The second problem with using purely rational arguments when it comes to religion is that all of us don't approach this from an objective standpoint. It's not like measuring somebody who's doing a long jump in a track and field meet, where you can just see just how far each person went. We all have something at stake in this question. So whether we believe in God or don't believe in God has a huge impact on how we choose to live, how we see things, how we think about the world. And so that's an important thing. And I'm certain there are believers who believe in God just because they find it to be a comfort. And I'm sure there are people who don't believe in God because they don't want to have anybody to be responsible to God. They don't want to be seen as the kind of people who depend on God. And so that question of just, is there an objective standpoint from which we can have these arguments, is a big question for me. At the end of every summer, we have the same family ritual. And what we do is we take our children to the airport and we leave them at the curb and they go off to college. And every time that we do that, we bring our little dog, Poppy, and she comes with us. And I sometimes wonder what this whole thing looks like to her. Does she think that our children live at the airport all year long and just come home for summers? Does she have any idea of that our son is studying number theory or how economics works or the environment of African nations or our daughter's interest in classical Greek or in Old English? Could our dog understand them singing in choirs? And in many ways, that is our situation when it comes to God. The theologian Karl Barth says that God chooses to be somewhat of a mystery to us, that we don't experience God on our own terms, but on God's terms. And Paul Tillich says that God doesn't exist at all, that God is so much bigger than existing. God is not an object in a world of objects, but is the very ground and basis for the existence of all those objects. Well, wherever you are in your exploration of the question of the existence of God, I wish you well. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and thanks for watching More Good News.